З величезною приємністю хочу оголосити початок роботи другого дня пленарного засідання нашої конференції «Капіталізм, популізм та модерн». І знов-таки маю величезну приємність і честь представити вам нашу сьогоднішню панель. Перш за все хочу представити людину, яка не потребує особливих представлень, оскільки має міжнародну репутацію. Це Дон Калб, він сам з Голландії, тривалий час працював в Відні в Інституті наук про людину. Тепер він є завідувачем кафедри соціології та соціальної антропології в Центральноєвропейському університеті в Будапешті. Кріс Вестон теж не потребує представлень, давно з ним дружимо, співпрацюємо. Андре Хаертле, він є лектором в Україні з політичних наук в рамках програм Німецького товариства академічних обмінів. І наша колега з Академії наук Республіки Білорусь, з Інституту соціології, Світлана Костюкевич. Привітаємо наших гостей. І почнемо наше засідання. Прошу Кріс Вестон, який буде сьогодні говорити про політичний розвиток в Сполучених Штатах в рамках піднесення популізму і про перспективи політичні президентства Дональда Трампа. Кріс, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. And again, I'd like to thank Pavlo for inviting me to Kyiv. I brought my computer with me today because the issue with the ongoing situation with Donald Trump is that as soon as you sort of turn around to concentrate on looking at the wider things, something else then develops in Washington. So since I've arrived in Kyiv, we've already heard that essentially a special prosecutor has been announced, and also yesterday, despite effectively the White House itself welcoming this appointment, Donald Trump resorted to a Twitter to basically say that this was all a Russian witch hunt and without foundation. A lot of the coverage of Trump centers around this whole issue of, has he sort of an allusion to previous history of events just about 40 years ago, and whether Trump has essentially achieved the sort of Watergate status that President Nixon did, and whether there is going to be an impeachment process ensuing. I think it's very important right at the start to understand what the impeachment means. The impeachment procedure is set out in the US Constitution. I think it is something like Article 1 or 2, so it's quite upfront. It is a means of removing the president from power, and it is an interesting amalgam of both the political and judicial process. It's well worth observing that it's quite rare in the United States presidential term. I believe up until the Nixon episode, which I'll discuss in a few moments, I think there was actually only one US president who was subject to the impeachment process. What I think has been quite interesting over the last 40 years, and which I'll try and cover in the presentation, is that there have been a number of instances where, quite frankly, the US politicians have been quite reluctant to get an impeachment process started, or indeed, if the impeachment process did commence, have been very reluctant to convict. And that is, as I said, an amalgam of both the political circumstances and whether the burden of proof is sufficient for the removal of a United States president. So with that in mind, let me just go through the initial, because I just wanted to sort of talk about sort of the approach. As always, with sort of history, you have, you know, the famous lines of Shakespeare's Macbeth, which is that, you know, it's full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. You can also go back to sort of original comments, I think, with even times of Plato where, you know, you could not step twice into the same river. There's also issues of, you know, whether you're picking and choosing facts to pursue a particular line of argument. I think the way I would look at it is there is a historical record. We've seen the events. The challenge then is to try and do a compare and contrast as to why you think certain events are pertinent to the particular matter in mind. And, you know, in terms of the sort of methodological issues, I draw attention to the sort of the book that was written by Arthur Schlesinger in 1973, literally at the peak of the Nixon crisis, which at that time was essentially saying, you know, the presidential prerogatives and powers, you know, make this sort of almost an imperial presidency without parallel. We have moved on a lot considerably since then. I mean, just to give you why the situation is perhaps even more of concern is that the National Security Council, which in Nixon's time was essentially running the sort of foreign affairs, just had a staff of about 30 to 40 people. These were the people who did the sort of the détente negotiations, the opening to China, just done with 30 to 40 people under Secretary Kissinger. Now, the National Security Council is about 350 to 400 people, essentially running events or running affairs out of the White House. The other aspect is that at the time, again, Nixon presidency, 1970s, early 70s, the White House counsel was just one individual, John Dean, who essentially pretty well gave up Nixon in return for immunity. But now you're talking about 30 to 40 lawyers working full-time out of the White House, essentially drafting executive orders for the president. That situation essentially was enhanced under President Obama. So, as I said, just to sum up, you have a different White House structure now than you did then. There is a considerable accretion to power. The other issue on the methodological is, and it's worth bearing in mind because, you know, there has been a moving on of technology and also how the media performs. In the 70s, there was a very vigorous investigative journalistic press. People may or may not be aware that the two top journalists for the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, wrote 2 books on the Watergate affair, and they did a lot of the sort of field work in terms of following the money that Nixon's sort of team had left behind them when they were conducting their various illicit affairs. There was also 3 major networks that were providing coverage. It's quite clear that over the last 25 years, with technology moving on and also because of the structure of the media, investigative journalism has essentially changed, I would say probably for the worse. And what you've got is, in fact, things like social media and Twitter, which President Trump uses to get his message over, and this sort of growing sort of construction of alt facts, alt media. The other issue, I would just say, is that, you know, part of the process is looking at the sort of themes and also the tone or maybe the tenor of the times rather than strict facts. I was very interested to look at or to hear some of the comments being made last week when James Comey, the FBI director, was fired. And there was an allusion to events, again, that took place during Nixon's time of the Saturday Night Massacre, when effectively Nixon terminated the special prosecutor, fired the Attorney General, and caused immense blowback on his own position, with the events of last Tuesday, which were then called the Tuesday Night Massacre, which followed Comey's sacking. Now, people of a Republican disposition were quite kid, well, you know, it's nothing like the Saturday Night Massacre, you know, it was a special prosecutor who's been removed. But the reality was that the guy who was running a major investigation into Trump was removed. And I think that event, which I'll probably outline in slightly more detail, is the sort of a theme that I would sort of try and draw out for lessons to be learned, rather than the fact that it was just not perhaps, you know, the removal of 3 people on a Tuesday, which is what certain people are alluding to. And that leads into this understanding nuances. And I'd also sort of try and come up to a sort of why do we think the events of the past are pertinent for consideration of the future of Trump's term in office. Sorry. Let me go on to the Watergate, just to give you the initial facts of the situation. June 1972, a guard in the Watergate complex, where the offices of the Democratic National Committee were located, found sellotape on the doors, which meant that people had obviously tried to get into the building and had left sticky tape on the doors to ensure they could exit. 5 men were arrested. Effectively, they were installing bugging devices in the offices. I believe they, in fact, technically were there to replace a device that had gone wrong. Those, very, very quickly afterwards, it was very firmly established that those guys were linked to the campaign to re-elect President Nixon at the time. And you know, the general coverage was of a minimal nature. It was a sort of, should we just say, par for the course in the United States. Previous presidents had done electronic eavesdropping of their opponents. In fact, Nixon himself had been subject to surveillance by his predecessor, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And there didn't really seem to be much of a political blowback on Nixon. In November 1972, when I talk about his coronation, I mean, Nixon won a considerable landslide in the elections of November. He won about 60% of the votes, and in fact, on his coattails, the Republicans moderately increased their presence in the House of Representatives. But that victory was very, very quickly to turn to ashes, because in sort of February 1973, so effectively Nixon had just been put back into office in late January. The storm clouds were starting to gather. People were starting to look very closely at the Watergate burglary and to try and portray it as part of a wider scheme of dirty tricks, which was more than likely, or in fact was very much the case. And the February 1973, the House of Representatives, the Senate essentially voted to launch a judicial committee into the events of Watergate. Now, if I just take the time reference from that point in time, from February 1973, a cascade of events and disclosures came out that essentially hold Nixon's presidency below the waterline, and he was essentially dead in the water, to put it mildly, by about July 1973. It's very clear from some of the memoirs at the time that Nixon effectively had got very little role in what was then taking place in the October War, but it was to take almost a year before he effectively resigned in August 1974. And that's the 2 pictures that I put down. This was the Nixon victory, you know, November 1972. The picture on the right is him in the White House, resigning in August 1974. It was a not-so-long goodbye. The Watergate affair led to 69 government officials being charged. Moving on. Just before I talk about the Clinton escapade, it's worth bearing in mind that because the Watergate affair and the proceedings that were going to lead up to the impeachment, Nixon never faced the impeachment process himself. The articles for his impeachment were drafted, and I think once he saw the writing on the wall, he essentially resigned. It was a pretty traumatic experience for the United States, and I think it was Gerald Ford, who was his then vice president, who took over as president, who said the long American nightmare is over. It was, as I said, an event that informed the United States political scene, and we obviously, whenever there is a scandal, it is typically known as something, the Gate, after the Watergate episode. It's quite important, again, to come back to this aspect, that it is a political process, and therefore it was interesting when Reagan was the president that he managed to escape impeachment, essentially for his involvement in breaking congressional laws, on supplying weapons to Iran, no more than 5 years after the embassy in Tehran had been taken over by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And he'd also, as part of a wider scheme, had been taking money to fund the Contras, which was, again, an illegal act. Now, despite meeting probably the definition of high crimes and misdemeanors, deliberately circumventing congressional rules, he managed to escape impeachment, partly because of his status, and because there was a marked reluctance by the Congress to go through essentially another traumatic episode like the Nixon affair. We then go to the Clinton era where, and this I think is one of the aspects that probably Donald Trump may have the most to fear about. The issue with Clinton was that because of certain ill-defined speculation about a real estate development called Whitewater, and also Hillary Clinton's perceived involvement in a White House travel agency, all fairly general stuff that would barely scrape a sort of a discussion of being a high crime misdemeanor, a special prosecutor was appointed to look into these various allegations. What came out of that special prosecutor, which I think is why Trump himself is concerned with this recent appointment, and why this thing suddenly becomes more dangerous for Trump, is that the special prosecutor who was looking at President Clinton, I think his name was Ken Starr, actually came up with something totally new that people had not even considered, which was Clinton had entered into an affair with a certain Monica Lewinsky in the White Office, and essentially he was then subpoenaed to answer questions, embarrassingly enough, on his sex life and his escapades in the White House. And in the course of that, Clinton essentially perjured himself. In other words, he made false testimony, and also through some of his acts committed an obstruction of justice. Now, what then ensued, I said, just to sum up, the actual special prosecutor had basically brought charges against Clinton that had absolutely nothing to do with his original appointment, but he had found out about this illicit affair with Monica Lewinsky and then basically had him subpoenaed. Clinton faced the impeachment process. So we're not talking about what happened to President Nixon, who managed to essentially resign and avoid the impeachment process. He actually faced the impeachment process. And this impeachment process was essentially enabled by the fact that the Republican Party controlled Congress. That is something that the Democrats had also been able to do with Nixon because they did control Congress. The fact that they then never went forward with the impeachment was purely because Nixon resigned. Clinton faced the impeachment process. And this is why I come back to the original point I made about this amalgam of the political and the judicial. The reality was that once all the facts were known in the Senate, Clinton, the obstruction of justice claim was essentially 50-50 vote, and the perjury to a grand jury, which was the really dangerous thing that Clinton had committed, was essentially a 55-45 vote. But according to the US Constitution, the Senate needed a vote of 67 in favor. So even though there was a majority, a bare majority for the perjury, he managed to escape the actual impeachment process and served out the time of his office. Mr. Trump goes to Washington. The various points I've got on this matter is we already have certain similarities developing between what Mr. Trump is doing, in the fact that almost within about a week of his inauguration, he'd already had a serious falling out with the CIA. That has also been further exacerbated because Trump has believed that he was under some form of surveillance by his predecessor, but has been unable to get anyone to effectively validate that claim. But the real matter that has created problems for Mr. Trump is the Russian problem. In all its various dimensions, this is the one that is now causing him the problems that I don't think he's going to probably be able to escape, and this is essentially what the special prosecutor has been appointed to do. There's clearly multiple dimensions to this Russian thing. Clearly, people in Ukraine will be familiar with Paul Manafort, who was essentially Trump's campaign manager, but I believe in his previous life was a sort of consultant to President Yanukovych. I believe that people, after the fall of Yanukovych, found documents alluding to various payments to Paul Manafort. So Paul Manafort is clearly a person of interest. The next person is the ill-fated National Security Advisor, Mr. Flynn, who was sacked literally several weeks after his appointment to essentially almost one of the leading positions in the White House. You've then got various people like Carter Page, who again was going to be a sort of a foreign affairs specialist for Trump, but because of the various allegations that were made in the press, he was not able to take up a role. Rex Tillerson, we know, is the Secretary of State, but clearly has worked very closely with the Russians. And also Mr. Sessions, who's now the Attorney General, who actually was forced to recuse himself for, again, making misleading testimony to Congress on his exact contacts with Russian officials. This is still, though, all smoke. There's a lot of smoke, but so far no one has actually been able to pin down precisely a connection between Trump and the Russians, notwithstanding a lot of press coverage on this matter. The campaign collusion also remains somewhat unclear, though Trump did not help himself during the campaign by essentially almost inviting the Russians to hack Hillary Clinton's email system, which we now know that they had done with the Democratic National Committee. But there is still powerful speculation around this sort of whole issue of the collusion and the timings of leaks that were then used to effectively implicate Hillary Clinton in various matters. And people, particularly in the national security state, remain puzzled why Trump remains so positive about trying to develop relations with Russia, despite their own their own misgivings. And also, the Russian problem is one of the few matters on which Congress is united. The Congress has essentially no time for good relations with Russia and is very keen not to do business with them. But this is the other one, which again is a speculative, but probably still may yet have more mileage, the personal business. Point I may well come back to later. But this one is the thing that I think we should consider when we look at what happened in Nixon's time. He won a 60% majority against a very, very poor Democratic contender. I think it was Henry McGovern, who was not viewed particularly by the Democratic establishment as a strong candidate. And let us be quite clear, Hillary Clinton, there were considerable misgivings amongst a wide part of the US electorate over her credibility and her viability as a proper Democrat. And I think the fact that, albeit that she lost by 3 million votes on the popular vote, should not detract from the fact that it was her election essentially to win, and despite all the general support, she failed to do that. A very good book that's come out in the last few weeks, called Shattered, which is an inside the Clinton campaign, is well worth looking at because of the criticisms that it makes of Hillary Clinton's whole approach to the election. She was not a very good candidate, let's be clear. And there is a concern that her loss is essentially being used by the Democrats to go after Trump. The Republican Party has a clear problem in that Trump was never their candidate. The establishment figures, people like Jeb Bush, had lost out. But the issue with Republicans is that they're now very much left with Donald Trump as the president. It is, if you look back at the Nixon era, in 1972, in the elections, the Democrats had both a majority in the Senate and a majority in the House of Representatives. And therefore they were able to push through particular process against Nixon. In 2016, you have a very, very slightly different set of circumstances. The Republicans have a majority in the Senate of 54 to 46, and they also have a very clear majority in the House of Representatives of 241 against the 197. They are very, very keen to continue to pursue their agenda, despite Donald Trump's presence. And their agenda has been very quite clear. There is repealing effectively it's the Obamacare, but it's the Affordable Health Care Act. And they're also very keen to push through their new tax laws. And at the present, if you're in the Republican Party, you have a particular concern about how you proceed with Donald Trump as your president. What is of interest is if you do go back to the Nixon affair, the Republicans essentially went along with the Democrats in terms of launching the judicial investigation into Nixon. And essentially, when the midterm elections came up in 1974, were actually able to not lose that many seats. The problem for the Republicans became after they'd removed Nixon, and it was Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, who essentially gave Nixon the pardon, because technically Nixon could have actually gone to jail, even though he had resigned. It was that decision to give the pardon to Nixon that I think was the contributory factor for where the Republicans then lost both in congressional elections and then subsequently the election to presidential election to Carter. The Republicans will be very, very keen to avoid that particular set of events, sequence of events, renewing itself, though they remain in a difficult position. They know that they may yet have to come together with the Democrats to push forward on some form of investigation, but they themselves will be very, very keen to avoid the implication of that particular judicial proceedings, because they seriously do not know what's at the end of it. And in one sense, that's why I come to this point that the Republicans face. I call the McCorber doctrine. There was a famous book from the 19th century of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, and one of the characters is a Mr. McCorber, who's always waiting for something to turn up. He's an optimist. And I think this is where the Republican Party right now is. They're waiting for something to turn up of a positive nature and for this all to go away. The investigation, I've already said that the events of the Watergate were that essentially the Republicans and the Democrats essentially came together to do the investigation. I've also alluded to the fact that the Republicans will be very keen not to see a similar set of circumstances for the moment, because they know that this could end up being their problem in terms of electoral success or otherwise. But I think the problems are now starting to develop with leaks. I alluded to the fact that Trump has had a falling out with the national security state, by which I've meant the CIA at the beginning, but more recently with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It is worth bearing in mind that the thing that undermined Nixon's term of office, second term of office, was the continual leaks, essentially by a very senior FBI official called Mark Felt, to the two journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, of allowing them to pursue leads and for a constant drip into the press of negative news and speculation about Nixon that, as I said, essentially terminated his presidency a year before he resigned. Those leaks are going to continue, and with President Trump, and the talk that the revelations that the FBI director, Comey, has got notes of all his conversations with Trump will invariably find their way into the public domain, I believe, over the next couple of months. I've already alluded to the Tuesday night massacre, but it's the consequence from that. And this is where, I think President Trump may not have learned from President Nixon. There are two things that come out from this particular issue. One of which is that Trump essentially made, at the time, a sort of a denial as to why he'd removed Comey, and essentially said that because of the Clinton investigation, that Comey was essentially no longer a fit and proper person to run the FBI. The problem that he then created for himself was that whereas that was viewed as possibly implausible, no one could then doubt what he said. But for him then to then say, well, in fact, the reason why I've got rid of him is because the Russian investigation, starts to create the biggest potential problem for Donald Trump. Under 18 of the US Code section 1512, a person who obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceedings or attempts to do so is essentially in obstruction of justice territory. There is a lot of debate right now as to whether Trump has fulfilled that the necessary condition, which is a corrupt intent to meet that obstruction of justice, impeachable offence. I think he's probably now in that territory, but the politics of the situation still remain that the Republican Party still has the votes in Congress, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, to stop any further impeachment proceedings developing for the time being. Matters have also not been helped by Donald Trump alluding to the fact that he has tapes of purported conversations with James Comey, essentially from his one-on-one meetings. For Trump to have made such a comment, I think points to a lack of understanding of what got President Nixon into his predicament, which was that it came out that Nixon had been running a secret tape recording, and Congress demanded the access to those tapes. It's very unclear right now whether those tapes do exist. I think for President Trump's own safety of mind, I think he will hope that there are no tapes, because it was the release of those tapes and the recordings that were a major contributory factor to President Nixon essentially resigning before he faced obvious impeachment. The obstruction of justice, I think I've just dealt with. Right, the final page I've got is essentially the milestones or the key indicators going forward. I've said right at the beginning, the appointment of a special prosecutor on Wednesday is probably a critical milestone now for Donald Trump, because the issue is that once a prosecutor is appointed, it is very, very difficult to control where that individual may go and what lines of interest he will pursue. The clear issue with Donald Trump is that there are a series of other aspects of his business affairs that still are at present hazy, but it's already well known in Washington that his business affairs have not been made very transparent. In fact, the thing that I myself have found of interest is I visited the Nixon Presidential Museum in Yorba Linda about 2 or 3 years ago. In one of the rooms, Nixon faced a problem early on in his career and essentially had to get an independent firm of auditors and an independent legal counsel to review his financial affairs. So far, Trump has not done anything of that nature. He's merely got his tax attorneys to do a pro forma letter saying that there's really nothing of interest. I know that there was this presentation that he gave with his tax lawyers that really raised more questions. But the problem with Donald Trump is that Congress is now asking a financial intelligence unit, something called FinCEN, for details of transactions involving the Trump businesses. I think that one could be very, very interesting, because there are allegations that Donald Trump has not been able to address, that his businesses have heavily relied on Russian money from state banks that are very close to the Kremlin. And they will very possibly have some form of embarrassment value, even if entered into on appropriate business terms. It's the midterm elections that I think will be the critical milestone for Donald Trump. On 6th of November 2018, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives will be up for grabs. In addition, just over a third of the Senate seats are also up for re-election. It will be interesting to see what the outcome of that election results are. If the Democrats do reclaim the House of Representatives, and right now it's a bit too early to say whether they will, but if they do, I think you will see very possibly the Democrats pushing the investigation even more vigorously and at least trying to initiate an impeachment proceedings. I think independent of that, you've also got the wheels of justice with the special prosecutor Robert Mueller, who's a former FBI director, now launching the Russian investigation, and where that may lead for the time being, we do not know. But if I was to predict, as a social scientist, I feel that it's appropriate to predict, I do not believe Trump will be impeached. I do not believe that for the moment there will be the votes to carry that impeachment process through. But I do believe Trump will essentially serve just this term in office. But that I would, as always, caveat with that it remains to be seen what the conflicts of interest and the Mueller investigation bring to light.
Thank you. І тепер, шановні друзі, питання, questions.
Sure.
Okay. Just use the mic. Chris. Just use the mic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, Chris, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting because it's so actual, right, to discuss those topics. I do not have a very kind of political science related remark. I'm just asking for out of curiosity. If one reads that as what's going on in the press, and basically it's all over, right? And it's every day. And basically this is going on for the last 4 months, essentially, right?
Yes.
One is kind of, as an observer, stuck between two sides. On the one side, there's this kind of, you have this certain, as a European Democrat, you have this bias, this natural bias against Trump, and you are tempted to find everything nice what is happening right now, right? On the other hand, when I look at what's out there as for clear evidence, what's been delivered there on this side, and if I'm also looking at what's at stake here, it's the legitimacy of a president, American president, who has been just elected. I tend to believe that this is really only a big campaign of the liberal-minded American and also international press against him. Where do you stand on those sides right now? What are you? And this is, of course, his argument also, right? The argument he uses that this is a big campaign against him, and finally. And this is also the point where I stand right now as a political scientist is I do not like Trump from a political and moral point of view, but as long as there is no evidence for any legal wrongdoings, I think what is happening right now could lead in the end, and this is out of my point of view the most likely scenario, that all this will end up in a kind of small legal battles, a lot of fuss, there will be no clear evidence, but the presidency will be tracked down and the institution will be heavily damaged after those 4 years. Where do you stand on this side?
I think you've made a singly valid point. I think the issue that's out there, that's why I made the reference to the Nixon. Let's just, for the moment, just look at the sort of the Nixon legacy, because I think unless we look at Nixon, I think the Trump situation can also be very difficult to Nixon, if you go through the Nixon library, this is a person who got a very significant political career, albeit that he engaged in dirty tricks. The reality was that he was probably doing no more, no less than what his predecessors had done. And that goes all the way back to Roosevelt even, who, and particularly under the Kennedy regime, because, you have people, Edgar Hoover doing sort of scrutiny, bugging of Martin Luther King. So, in one sense, you've got much the same. You also, I think, had a serious political legacy ahead of him. The issue was that he also won an overpowering majority, 60% landslide, attested to people's view that Nixon was the one and that he was an elected president. I think the problem with the Watergate affair is that the drip of allegations and the times of troubles, because we're talking about the winding down of the Vietnam War, a general sort of rebellion against the party establishment was taking place. Essentially this sort of delegitimizing of Nixon essentially it led to his resignation, albeit he tried to stay in office as long as possible to counteract this thing. The issue with Trump, I think, is not too dissimilar. I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that Hillary Clinton, albeit she won the popular vote, did not win the Electoral College. And her own weaknesses, her own lack of credibility were major contributors to that, as well as an expectation that, somehow she deserved to win. And I think that's an issue that we, as perhaps European social democrats, centrists, run the risk of trying to second-guess the Americans. There is every reason to believe, and I think Salvatore made these comments yesterday, that there was a lot of unhappiness with the political establishment of the United States, and Donald Trump won. And let's be fair, he did win. It wasn't fair, it wasn't very attractive, it was very unpleasant, and we can all look back on the things that he said. I think the problem that Trump has set himself up for is some of those issues are very much like Richard Nixon. The sort of tricky-dicky routine, the sort of trying to bring out dog whistle politics, I think is the expression. And I think Trump has done that to an extra degree, which is why there is a virulent rejection of him, particularly by the Democratic Party, who are also very keen to try and take the House. But I think this delegitimizing of Trump is going to be the problem that the Democrats may end up coming to rue. They were, if you look at what happened in the past, they were clearly, made sure that Nixon was driven from office. And the Republicans were very keen to see Ken Starr do the same to Clinton. The Reagan seemed to be this happy interlude where people just didn't proceed with impeaching a president who probably had more cause to be impeached than either Nixon or Clinton. So I think you're right. But the problem I think that has been set up is that Trump is clearly at war essentially with most of Washington, whether it's the national security state or the CIA, FBI, and that, I think, spells danger for him. Dutch colleague.
Well, I very much agree with all the analysis you are making, which are very well informed, and I thank you for that. You have probably seen these articles that Paul Fry has been writing in The Guardian, which is about how a bunch of billionaires, yes, and Bannon is included there too, have got hold of a very large number of Facebook contents, and developed with a couple of specialized agencies these what is it, big data analyses of let us say, super volatile, highly nervous potential non or yes voters, both in the UK and in the US. Which brings the Brexit issue and Theresa May and Trump in a very, very interesting way together, right? Because both these elections were so-so, very small differences, and with this very specific targeting, and apparently it was about 500,000 messages that were sent out just the day before Brexit to these specifically targeted people, have pushed the very volatile balances just over the threshold towards Brexit and towards Trump. It's very interesting stuff. Russia, again, seems to be involved here in one way or another, but again, it's not entirely exposed.
Exactly.
What do you think of this stuff? For me, it's a little bit abracadabra, but it's at the same time not unimaginable at this point in time. What do you think?
About, sorry?
What do you think about these allegations that this sort of billionaire-driven,
yes,
and which is of course very interesting because you're not talking about the classical ruling class anymore, right? These are not the big corporations. This is not Wall Street. This is not even Hollywood. These are just billionaires,
yes,
from disparate sectors that have, that are not very well educated necessarily, bring stuff together, and then in combination with Facebook and with these new big data analytics can actually push elections in this particular way. And then apparently Russia involved. So I really want to know what you think about this.
I think that this is I hasten to say my strong view based on what I've seen and what I suspect has gone on is that the Russians were implicated in helping Trump. I think there is a coincidence of various disclosures that were damaging to Hillary Clinton, that were timed. I would also hasten to add one of the big problems that was created for Hillary Clinton was a decision by James Comey within a few weeks of the election, basically saying that they were looking at the computer of, I think it was the husband, the estranged husband of one of Hillary Clinton's aides. Now, that was I think, I saw Comey's testimony, and I remain skeptical whether he was really on quite a safe ground. But that judgment call, I think, was as big a contributor to Clinton losing than perhaps the Russian collusion. There's one point I think you've alluded to, which I think is quite interesting. And I think you mentioned about the billionaires, but just look at who's making up the cabinet of Trump. It's a club of billionaires and multimillionaires. And there is another sort of Russian angle to this, which I think is also of interest. There is, Betty DeVos, who was elected the Secretary for Education, I believe on essentially the deciding vote of the Vice President in her Senate confirmation hearings, who is totally inexperienced and whatever. But Betty DeVos's original name is Prince, and who should be under some scrutiny for contacts with the Russians during some of this period of time, but her brother Eric Prince, who is the founder of Blackwater, who is believed to have met with senior Russian officials in the Seychelles. So you can see where all this sort of, conspiracy could be going. And the question that everyone's got right now, which is, hopefully there will be, this investigation will get to the bottom of, is, what is the nature of these connections? Is it just the fact that you've got the sort of plutocracy at the top who are very good at cutting deals with each other? Because that, believe me, does happen. Whether Clinton's own foundation is accused of taking money, favoring Russians on particular deals. You've got some of the billionaires who are in the cabinet who clearly have got Russian business connections through ordinary course of affairs. I mean, the Russian banks, quite active in lending. I'd be very surprised, and I think it's well known, that the Russians have effectively financed a lot of Trump's business investments. Now, you know, where does it become the fact that Trump doesn't want to disclose that because of his own natural lack of wanting to be transparent? Because if he did want to be transparent, he shouldn't have been the President of the United States. I mean, those are the rules that, you know, effectively everyone was expected to play by. He doesn't want to play by those rules, which leads into another interesting sub-discussion about how much of these rules are informal. You know, there is an expectation that you do this rather than it being very clearly defined under the Constitution or specific rules. Because Trump has just driven a horse and cart through some of those rules. So, you know, I think where I come from is that, you know, I think Trump has compounded the problems that he faces through his own lack of experience, and I think these events are going to catch up with him. But I come back to the point you've made. It is going to be a very, very difficult 3 years for the United States, because I don't think there will be the votes for the impeachment unless something comes up that is a game changer. I can't rule that out. Sorry, one colleague.
Thank you very much for coming and your presentation. My name is Igor, and the question is like that. 2 days ago, all media in USA write a statement about the leak to CBI or FBI, CIA or FBI about the government. Forgot about the statement. The question is, the talk about and speech about impeachment of Trump is the only one who needed is mass media after their confrontation.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch. Sorry, I didn't.
The only one who needs the impeachment of Trump is mass media after their confrontation with Trump.
I just come back to the issue of the impeachment. It is a very curious amalgam. I just don't think there are the votes. I know that a Democratic congressman has stood up and said we should impeach Trump, but there is no evidence that the Republicans are willing to break with the president. That may well change, I think, after the midterm elections. But I think there will be hoping. That's why I mentioned the sort of McCorber expression. I think they're waiting for something to turn up. But I have to say, I think the Republicans are going to have I think they're going to be in a very, very difficult position. I don't think, you know, we've looked at the repeal of the Affordable Health Care Act. Well, they got the vote through the House of Representatives, but they still need to get that through Senate. I don't think there is much evidence that they'll be able to do that. I think what you have, and the comments made by some of my colleagues here about the delegitimization of Trump, mean it's going to be very, very difficult to advance the Republican agenda. I mean, I think the tax cuts, I just can't see how those are going to be able to go through without considerable modification. I think the Democrats are not going to break ranks in terms of helping Trump push through his agenda, or even the Republicans. I think we were already, as I said, in a very, very difficult position, and those circumstances, I think, should be shared. The blame should be going around equally, because I think Donald Trump's own miscues and comments have not helped his position. Albeit he is the elected president. I mean, he does not have a background in Washington. Albeit he is an insider of some form, but his lack of ability to be able to build bridges, I think, is going to be his undoing. But it's going to be very difficult to get him out of office now. The one thing I also mentioned, I forgot to mention, was there is actually a mechanism, which is the 25th Amendment, which is that you have the Vice President and the majority of the Cabinet voting to remove him. I don't see that as a viable option. I mean, his cabinet is full of billionaires and multimillionaires. And I just do not see them breaking ranks with Trump. I know that they certainly didn't under Nixon. For the obvious reason, I think Nixon had all their resignation letters signed but not dated. I would be very surprised if Trump has not got something similar. I think these people are going to be the last people to urge him to go. And therefore, I think, as I said, the problem for the United States now is how do you remove someone like that? Because I think he's going to be around for a lot longer. Sorry.
Chris, you know so much that I want to push you again on something, but this is of a different level.
Okay.
So, I mean, you are a social democrat, but I am a Marxist, and here's a Marxist question to you.
Okay.
The Trump moment signifies in a way the moment at which a coherent ruling class in the top of the state apparatus and connected to the global economy in the US is falling apart. Right? This is a bunch of billionaires.
Yep.
With no coherent interests at all. That's why they are so shady and connected to all sorts of things that nobody really has has a clear sight of. Until now, you had a sort of coherent ruling class. Either it was financed from Wall Street, or it was financed from high tech, or it was financed from the big old corporations, GE or General Motors, Ford, or it was financed from Hollywood. Well, all of these are coherent interests, class interests in the Marxian sense. Now, do you think that this collapse of a coherent ruling class that we are seeing, is that a coincidence? I don't think it's a coincidence. I think the populist moment is precisely also about that. So, first question, do you think it is a coincidence? And if it is not a coincidence, what sort of a ruling class are we getting back after this? Okay, that's enough.
I think it's a really interesting question. I slightly differ from you, though I could not but sort of respond by saying, Marx is first as tragedy, then as farce with what's going on with Trump. I have a slightly different take on what you're saying. My sort of ruling class thing comes from sort of Pareto, Gaetano Mosca. My take on the Trump administration, and sorry, I didn't go into it in much detail because of time and trying to get to the point. I have a sort of a hypothesis that there is essentially a national security state. And, okay, sort of not developed, I've alluded to it in a paper that I've written, but the interesting thing right now about what's happening in Washington is this whole issue of who's in charge. It is absolutely no coincidence that as soon as Trump got inaugurated, literally the first person to do the travels all around the world was James Mattis, the US Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, was almost invisible. His position has very much been undermined by budget cuts, which I think will take about 40% off this budget. The national security state, which I allude to in the paper, has been also one of the critical things that have changed since the imperial presidency. And a lot of it happened under the Reagan era. The growing propensity for serving officers to become the head of the National Security Council, to occupy positions in key intelligence roles, the growing republicanization of the officer class, which has taken place since the 1970s. And if you look also at that combined with how Congress is, I mean, there is a law case that went all the way to the Supreme Court that basically was trying to get who of the members of Congress are still officers in the American Armed Forces. The ruling was that they would not disclose. but it has become quite clear, because the reason being is because, strictly speaking, under the Constitution, you cannot hold another office under the Constitution. A commission is another office. And they were the Supreme Court decided that there was no need to disclose that. But we know from a variety of sources, look at Robert Gates's last version of his memoirs, that there is a congressional industrial complex that basically says, you know, in my congressional district, I need those military bases because they're a good basis for my support, for my income. I can say right now, if you go virtually anywhere in the United States, this military-industrial complex is prevalent. Rather than going down the marks, I would sort of look at C. Wright Mills, The Power Elite, which has got to be one of the great political texts, political sociological texts, about this close connection between the military, the financial, and also the politics. And I think that would be where I would sort of go for in terms of sort of the ruling elite. Yes, Trump has filled his cabinet with billionaires, but it is the sort of military-industrial complex that I think wields still the effective power in Washington. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So,